Okay, so welcome to our another PoSoCoMeS seminar. I'm Jogila Ulinskaite. I'm going to be hosting the seminar. This is our last seminar of this semester, but not least exciting. Actually, I really looked forward to the seminar. I think, very well goes with the summer. I mean, it's about art, and I hope it inspires us for the whole season. So the way we will proceed, I will briefly, just in several sentences, mention the books, mention the author, and mention the discussants. Then we will proceed with brief presentation of the books. Tonight, we have even two books, so I think it's even a bigger pleasure to attend the seminar. And then we will proceed with the questions from discussants, and then we will follow with the answers, and then I will open the floor to everyone to ask the questions that are interesting for them. So briefly about today. Today we're discussing two books. Author of the books and editor of one of the books is Dr. Svitlana Biedarieva. She is an art historian, artist, and curator. She holds PhD in History of Art from the Courtauld Institute of Art, University of London. She's the editor of Harvard History of Ukrainian Art, forthcoming book series, and also serves as president-elect of the Society of Historians of East European, Eurasian, and Russian art and architecture. She is also the founder of Ukraine Decolonial Studies Network. And of course, she published books and texts in leading academic journals and media outlets. The books that we are discussing today are two. So first one is called Ambicoloniality and War, the Ukrainian-Russian Case. It was published by Palgrave, Macmillan in 2024. And this book proposes a new notion of ambicoloniality to speak about the current situation when Ukraine has become Russia's territory of obsession, and Russia, in its desire to occupy Ukraine, has in effect subjected itself to Ukraine's symbolic dominance. The book inquires into historical and cultural reasons for the emerging gap between the two states. It examines the role that cultural hybridity plays in political self-identification in both Ukraine and Russia, and how this hybridity has manifested in society and culture following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 until 2023. The second book is called Art in Ukraine Between Identity Construction and Anti-Colonial Resistance. It's published also in 2024 by Routledge. This edited volume traces the development of art practices in Ukraine from the 2004 Orange Revolution through 2013-2014 Revolution of Dignity to the ongoing Russian War of Aggression. Contributors explore how transformations of identity, the emergence of participatory democracy, relevant changes to cultural institutions, and the realization of the necessity of decolonial release have influenced the focus and themes of contemporary art practices in Ukraine. Our discussants are also two today. First one is Valeria Korobleva, is assistant professor at the Department of Russian and East European Studies and the head of the research center Ukraine is Changing Europe at the Institute of International Studies, Charles University. She is also affiliated with the French Research Center in Humanities and Social Sciences Prague as a co-PI in the project A Subaltern that Sings, from sound resistance to musical diplomacy in wartime Ukraine. She holds a PhD from Kharkiv University and habilitation from Kyiv University. She also held manifold fellowships and visiting professorships. Her expertise covers post-Soviet transformations in the Central Eastern European region with a focus on performative politics and entangled imperial colonial legacies. Second discussant, Victoria Rimytė-Viršiūnienė, is a postdoctoral researcher at Vilnius Academy of Arts and assistant professor at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science, Vilnius University. She received her PhD in political science and memory studies in 2022 at Vilnius University. Currently, she is conducting postdoctoral research, the positive aspect of desovietization, the compatibility of the narrative and visuality. Her main specialization includes the analysis of memory processes and expressions of collective memory as politically significant objects with a focus on public spaces and visual memory practices that fill them. So that was my brief introduction, and now I give the Microsoft to Svitlana to talk about her books and what are the most important points that we should know before discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yogile, for the introduction and for such detailed introduction, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Valeria and Victoria, for being discussants today. It's really a pleasure that we can discuss these publications and maybe find out some kind of new aspects of these books that I still even didn't consider. And I will start my presentation. I have a PowerPoint, and let's hope it works, because didn't have time to test it, but please let me know if it works for you.
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about two books. The first one is a monograph, which is entitled Ambicoloniality and War, the Ukrainian-Russian Case, and it was published by Palgrave Macmillan in February 2025. And the second one is the book Art in Ukraine, Between Identity Construction and Decolonial Resistance, is an edited volume to which Ukrainian and international curators, art historians, and art critics contributed their texts in an attempt precisely to discuss how the anti-colonial resistance unfolded in Ukraine after the onset of the full-scale invasion, but how also these changes of identity were manifested long before in the period between the two revolutions of 2004, the Orange Revolution, and the Euromaidan Revolution of 2013-2014, and then with the beginning of the war of Russia against Ukraine. And the authors of the text, they speak about a variety of topics, which I will discuss further, but they focus precisely on these aspects of identity, decoloniality, and agency in the time of important social changes. I will start with the book Ambicoloniality and War, and this is an endorsement that I asked Slavoj Žižek to write for presenting this book at the Latin American market. Because as some of you may know, I'm based in Mexico, and currently I'm preparing a translation of this book into Spanish, which will be published by one of Mexican publishers. And I needed something that positions it in introductory way, because there is nothing that was published until now on Russian colonialism in relation to Ukraine and the effects of Russian colonialism as wider effects on the post-Soviet space. So here Žižek highlights precisely that the introduction of the notion coloniality and colonialism as applied to Russia-Ukraine relationship is very important in order to understand fully the history and the history of resistance, and also the ways of how this entanglement that resulted in the neo-colonial war developed throughout decades and throughout entire centuries. However, the main point of this book is not only to introduce this field that many colleagues already after 2022 started looking at with from different perspectives, disciplinary perspectives and different conceptual perspectives, and they found the gap between existing theories that are applicable to other regions in the globalized world, but not fully applicable to Ukrainian case. Neither postcolonial theory and the decolonial theory. And therefore, this book draws on both findings of postcolonial and decolonial theories, but attempts to develop this theory further, drawing on a vast range of case studies from not only from visual art, but from literature, from theater, but with main attention paid precisely to the development of appropriate terminology and particular visions that could situate Ukraine within this global post-colonial realm. So this book proposes a new notion of ambicoloniality to speak about the current situation when Ukraine has become Russia's territory of obsession. And Russia, in its desire to occupy Ukraine, has in effect subjected itself to Ukraine's symbolic dominance. Ambicoloniality presents a key point of divergence from already existing models. The mutual impact of the two countries over centuries has gone both ways, over a shared border, in contrast to many other empires that established their colonial power relations at a distance. The Ukrainian-Russian case is different from the examples covered both post-colonial and decolonial theorists, as I mentioned. And to explore the reasons and consequences of such a different process of colonial expansion, anti-colonial struggle, and decolonial release, the book inquires into the historical and cultural reasons for the emerging gap between the two states. It examines the role that cultural hybridity plays in political self-identification in both Ukraine and Russia, and how this hybridity has manifested in society and culture. And the time frame is starting from 1991 and until 2023. This is the official text for the book, but of course it is possible to delve into kind of more profound and in-depth discussion that I would expect to have regarding this particular book. Today I just will highlight some of the notions, if the time permits me. This is the table of contents, and the book is divided into 6 chapters and an introduction that here is listed as an independent chapter. And it covers the questions of anti-colonialism versus self-colonization, where I rely on the definition of Alexander Kyosef and develop it further in order to develop the notion of ambicoloniality rather than self-colonization. Then it introduces the notion of ambicoloniality. It speaks about the revolution of identity during Euromaidan and how Euromaidan affected both self-perceptions of Ukrainian society and triggered various kind of not that visible processes of change, and how these processes were responded by Russian culture. War is one of the central chapters of this book, and there I speak about how the new epistemology of violence is created in this ambicolonial network framework, and how also this can relate to some new theoretical findings, not new and not the new theoretical findings in discussion of other examples of wars, such as, for example, the notion of necropolitics by Achille Mbembe, the war machine by Deleuze and Guattari, and so on. And I'm trying to kind of to round it up in some kind of coherent argument about war violence that Russia imposed on Ukraine. The chapter Desire speaks about colonial desire and what drives it, and in which way it is expressed in the neo-colonial attempts at expansion of Russia. And finally, ruin and reconstruction. But, it gives this kind of optimistic point of view that any ruin, any destruction will be inevitably followed by the reconstruction process, and Ukraine needs already to think and is thinking precisely about the ways how culture can give an impulse for reconstruction and regeneration. So, okay, here I have quite a lot of text, and I will try really to be fast with it because I would like to give some kind of key points, even though I don't have so much time for it. Ambicoloniality encompasses the particular dynamics of the centuries-long twofold exchange of cultural and symbolic influences characteristic of Russian colonialism in Ukraine. Ambicoloniality can be addressed from a broader cultural framework that takes into account cultural proximity and the institutional and infrastructural networks supporting it, and the shared geographical and political borders between the two countries. The idea of ambicoloniality does not consider colonialism as a product of inequality of economic and political positions and the initial difference in ethnic and nation-based rigid hierarchies, including subject-object relationships. Rather, it sees power as a symbolic exchange rooted in the cultural strengths of the parties involved. Then I speak also about polymorphous coloniality as applied to Russia. The polymorphism of Russia is one of the reasons, along with cultural proximity, for the colonial situation. Russia's centuries-long dissatisfaction with its place in the world in world power hierarchies led to the creation of a mimicry mechanism that worked twofold. First, borrowing from the Cold War narratives on anti-imperialist resistance, Russia imitates anti-colonial struggle in its war-fueling propaganda, exercising its invented victimhood as a geopolitical other. That's what we saw at the beginning of Russia's warfare events on Ukraine. Second, it refers to the complex affective relationship between Russia and Ukraine formed by centuries of struggle and domination. Ukraine in this colonial optics is viewed through the lens of similarity as a brotherly another, yet the same Slavic nation. The colonizer's blindness to intrinsic differences overshadowed by colonial belonging is the key to projecting the situation of the oppressed and their unique characteristics on the oppressor, resulting in particular self-other. Then in the chapter on colonial desire, I see it as one of this kind of key notions to explain the ambicolonial relationship. In an ambicolonial relationship, there is a fascination by the colonizer with the symbolic field of the subaltern country and a desire for its appropriation. This is expressed in a more effective way than in traditional forms of colonization, as a desire for cultural, political, and social adherence to another state's customs and traditions is driven by a deep emotional attachment. The anti-colonial war of Russia against Ukraine shows a profound connection between ambicolonial affection and the Lacanian interpretation of response, where the desire receives destructive and deadly effects both on its colonial subject and object. Searching for an imaginary sense of reunification, the neocolonial aspiration of Russia transgresses, splits, and eventually destroys the object of longing, which is nevertheless a utopian object, and loses its own integrity in chasing this fantasy of the past. So I compare this ambicolonial system to two pillars. One is oppressed, once the oppressed is emancipated, the oppressor falls under the weight of the demolition structure of colonial power. This failure represents this falling represents the ultimate loss of not only territories, but also of the predatory and manipulative cultural system supporting colonial entanglement. The war of Russia in Ukraine aims to maintain this imaginary balance, precisely of ambicoloniality, substituting power, sustaining the ambicolonial system with violence. And here I refer to Hannah Arendt's notion of powerless violence. So, whereas the void of power, violence emerges. However, what escapes their attention is that the opposite pillar supporting colonialism became decrepit long ago. Ukraine has undergone several rites of passage from three Maidan revolutions in 1990, 2004, and 2014, to the proven ability for active resistance through the military front line and the decolonization of the cultural field. So, in short, this is the theoretical part that I wanted to talk about. And these are some of the images that I use from Ukrainian artists in the book to precisely critically reflect on this notion of colonial entanglement between Ukraine and Russia and the ways how this colonial entanglement works reciprocally, turning into the concept of ambicoloniality. So these are just some of the examples, and going to the second book, Miroslava Mudrak positions this book as a kind of new a product of the collaborative work of a new generation of artists, activists, art critics, and art historians who do not have already the active memory of the Soviet era, because they already overcame this trauma of historical entanglement. However, this book has contributions from a variety of different perspectives and different authors who address the questions of memory in very different ways, who work with this question of trauma, and who turn back to the Soviet legacy to reinterpret it in the current volume. And this is the table of contents. It is divided into 3 parts: solidarity, identity, and decoloniality. And the texts are written by Ksenia Nuril from Museum of Modern Art in New York, Ася Biedarieva, the independent scholar, Jessica Zychowicz, Alexandra Asachi, Alisa Loshkina, Eva Sulek, Katerina Filuk, Ilya Levchenko, and Katerina Botanova. And also it includes one of my texts. And the preface to this book is written by Ukrainian literary scholar, Professor Vitaly Chernetsky, who speaks about the epistemological value of contemporary art practices. So you can see here some of the research questions that I included into the introduction, and that encompassed more or less the entire concept of this book. How has the postcolonial condition been expressed in Ukrainian culture after 2004? And how has its transitoriness been gradually replaced by decolonial processes following 2014? How has participatory democracy manifested within the art projects realized during the two revolutions of 2004 and 2014? How have transformations of identity occurred in the years following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea? How does art contribute to the interpretation of and resistance to the ongoing destruction and violence? What is the timeline of changes in contemporary Ukrainian art in relation to the chronology of the country's social turmoil? And should we speak of identity beyond ethnic or political at all? Or should we develop a more nuanced understanding of the underlying causes of unity in the face of military aggression? Just to say, should we speak more about agency, or rather than one single identity, a diversity of identities that are persisted in some kind of exchange and dialogue? And the authors, in different ways, addressing ecological topics, topics of gender, topics of war and violence, and relation between the past and the present and the future, they addressed precisely these questions. Briefly, the introduction outlines the models that I'm using also in the book of Ambicoloniality and war, although there the concept of ambicoloniality develops all of the stages. It goes not as one of the stages, but rather a logical connection between the stages. It is the stages of anti-colonial, post-colonial, and decolonial. As Frantz Fanon proposed in his famous book, colonialism fosters segregation, dividing the world and separating territories into compartments. And as the Ukrainian scholar Marko Pavlyshin proposed as early as in 1992, anti-colonialism is a mirror image of colonialism, borrowing from its methods and worldviews, yet it thematically inspires and fuels the subsequent post-colonial transformation. So basically, if you think about the anti-colonial stage, typically is a very short stage when a structure of power produced by colonialism is falling apart and the resistance emerges. And this radical resistance undertakes the characteristics of colonial attitudes, because it's the only point of reference that it can use for its for its action. And this is a really short stage in a normal process of colonial dissolution. which is followed by a postcolonial transformation. As Pavlician mentioned, by the early 1990s, Ukrainian culture was already fully postcolonial in terms of its creativity, relativity, and pragmatism, developing a binary opposition with the preceding radical anti-colonial struggle. It is also not only developing a binary opposition, but is also informed and borrows the topics from this anti-colonial struggle. Yet it is much less radical. It's based on rethinking and recombination. Tamara Gundarova, Ukrainian literary scholar, speaks about one aspect of post-colonial transformation, that is transit culture. Transit culture is not only a post-colonial phenomenon for her, but also a result of the post-totalitarian cultural memory. It unfolds in a space where there is a sense of presence of the past in the present, and that there is also a threat that the future can be a repetition of the past. And this necessity of turning back to traumatic history is justified in post-colonial conditions that Ukraine endured, as I propose in my text, from 1991 to 2014, precisely with this feeling of the direct threat of repetition of the past in the future. However, as Gundarova points out, this transitoriness has also to be transcended. It's just a temporary process. And I propose that it goes towards decolonial detachment and decolonial release. While the postcolonial condition denotes the situation immediately following the colonial experience and anti-colonial struggle, taking on all the implications of colonialism to reinterpret them, the decolonial situation speaks about the final process dismantling the colonial narrative and producing new knowledge, looking at the present and the future. And this is something that we start seeing in Ukrainian culture and exemplified by contemporary art already following 2014, the documentation of the war and the turning of the artists to the history that was unfolding in front of them as witnesses of these historical events, rather than turning back to this unclear, contested memory and to the traumatic experiences of the past. So I propose this chronology, which of course was just part of my framework with which I work. But there is here a number of images from the texts of authors of the individual chapters that I don't have time to discuss in detail, unfortunately, but you can see the diversity of protest art and how contemporary art and also some kind of historical examples, as we can see here in the work of Jessica Zachovich, how they address the current and unfolding situation. So I just will show some parts, and yeah, these are just some of the few images that are in the book itself, which is richly illustrated in color and with some images in black and white. So this is all the presentation that I wanted to give, and thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to the productive discussion, and I hope this was interesting to listen to. Thank you.
Thank you, Svitlana. I suggest not to wait for anything and proceed with discussion, and I would invite Valeria to provide comments and questions. And
good, thank you so much. First of all, greetings from Prague. I heard this is the last session in this season of your wonderful community, but in July we have a forthcoming MSA conference, and as a member of the local advisory board, I'm looking forward to hosting part of your community here. And certainly thank you, Svitlana and Yogili, for this invitation and for an opportunity to engage with these very productive ideas. I don't know how much time do I have, something like 5-10 minutes, is it okay?
10 minutes is...
10 minutes, good, because I can talk long, and I could absolutely second Slavoj Žižek's sentiment that it's a wonder that such a book has not been written before, and congratulations, Svitlana, with coming up with this very productive notion of ambicoloniality. So we all know that the full-scale invasion, Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 inspired this huge decolonization boost, and that became like the word of the day and even a buzzword, what Maria Sonevitsky called the decolonization vertigo, when people use and misuse it in different contexts. But not too many serious scholarly work has been published ever since trying to seriously argue what is the place of Ukraine on the global map of variegated colonial experiences. And I would think that starting from 2022, activism was going far ahead of scholarly reflection. So we saw some opportunities of educational activism, but also artistic activism, which is exactly the point of convergence between those two books that we are discussing today. We also saw some shifts in different domains, and some of them were far more reactive to this decolonization invitation than others. And maybe not surprisingly, but it was exactly the post-colonial and decolonial studies community that was the most reluctant to accept the use of these lands towards the east of Europe. And I personally have encountered several instances of all those heated discussions whether this language could be applicable to the case of Russian-Ukrainian historical entanglements. And the usual set of arguments against go in the direction of that basically structurally it does not fit what we have as accepted and recognized as cases of colonial oppression. So usually people talk about the lack of geographical distance, this proximity and shared borders, which exactly Svitlana elaborates on, and the lack of racial difference, that we do not have the racism as we imagine that. However, what is not often articulated but is there is simply that the system of coordinates is different because this type of anti-colonial struggle is tentatively pro-Western and anti-Russian, and usually in decolonial and post-colonial communities exactly the opposite. And here, I really like this epistemological move which Svitlana is doing, and I totally sympathize with this cause, that the difference is not a valid argument to abandon the lands altogether, but to refine the approach, because basically if we describe and explain what is the specificity of the Russian-Ukrainian colonial entanglement, that might potentially be a fruitful contribution to the post-colonial and decolonial studies. And this is like an ongoing conversation, and it's not an easy one, but as I started talking, I have encountered several cases when decolonization was put in quotation marks, and then people were referring exactly to Svitlana's notion of ambicoloniality. And I think that it's a brilliant discovery, because even without reading a book, somehow you have this intuitive feeling that it is precisely about this specificity and ambivalence of those entanglements that is there. And in a way, it achieves more than one goal, because not only like this is very creative, but it is an example of theory making, not just theory testing on the ground, because we know that Eastern Europe is very often a site of field work, but not really a site of knowledge production and theory building. And I think that it fills in this gap too. And what is important for me, that Svitlana's positionality, that she's coming from the artistic community as a scholar, but also as a curator and practitioner. And it is important on several levels, because as Svitlana points in her book, it was precisely cultural activism, artistic activism, that became one of the main sites of reclaiming the agency and the link to stimulate this decolonial release, which is the ultimate goal, according to this position. And Katerina Batanova, one of the authors of the second book of the edited volume, she has written a number of essays, and she was arguing that the Maidan was this point, the turning point, when artists that tended to be very apolitical suddenly accepted embracing simultaneously the role of a citizen and an artist, not as controversial to each other, but mutually supportive. And I think this is the ethos that could be traced in both books, and this is what it is partly about. But also we know that artistic community is like historically embedded in the leftist discourse. And what Svitlana is doing is, in her book, it's kind of interesting, because like all the sources can be grouped in three baskets. On the one hand, she engages with decolonial scholars, precisely trying to engage into dialogue, even if it's like at times it could be one-sided, but hopefully it turns into true dialogue. Then the post-colonial studies in Ukraine, the previous generation that used to be very literature-centric, the authors that Svitlana was referring to. And I think it's also indicative that we moved from reflections on solely like the text, the literary text, but now to performing arts that have increasing importance in the ongoing Ukrainian struggle. And then we have a lot of fantastic examples precisely of these artistic manifestations and so on and so forth. So I should credit Svitlana that the book is simultaneously, like, I should credit her for erudition and creativity. And this combination is not common. It's rarely going together. So she quotes almost all relevant sources in the field, being very knowledgeable, but at the same time, it's a very bold creation of new notions. And it's not only the ambicoloniality, which has already been mentioned, and it's in the title, but also syncretic polarization, which is one of the most important notions for Svitlana, I believe, and a number of others. So it is a very dense and rich read. Since I'm teaching the course for several years already, the post-colonial condition in Eastern Europe, I certainly would put it on the syllabus. And I think that those colleagues who are well-versed in post and decolonial studies would not be surprised. Those who are coming from different domains might find it a bit like challenging. It's really a very dense text, but then the artistic examples complement them nicely. So praising all that, probably I would just sort of questions, if not criticism, but sort of my reservations. What I would say that we should not probably, so I was wondering if it is an analytical model or is it like descriptive? Because from my perspective, the way the recent developments in Ukraine are depicted in the book, and I'm talking specifically about the ambicoloniality one, it's a bit too linear, even teleological. And I imagine that the reality on the ground is much more messy, and there are many loops and backslides and detours. And we have these patterns of anti-colonial struggle, post-colonial patterns, but also decolonial, delinking, it's all there. Then it's a bit too exceptionalist, very strongly arguing that the Russian-Ukrainian case is exceptional. But since even the book itself alludes to saying that it's the Russian-Ukrainian case, we might think that it could be applied also to other cases. And I would be curious to hear if this notion could be applied indeed to other cases, because then it would legitimate this contribution to post and decolonial studies. Because my intuition is that very often we compare our colonial experiences with not with other colonial experiences in other parts of the world, but with their simplified interpretations. But if we look at most contemporary writings on imperial legacies in different parts, we see that it's much more ambiguous and ambivalent there. And we have these multi-directional influences everywhere, and this colonial obsession of the empire, this phantom pain of lost territories and so on. So maybe the Russian-Ukrainian case shows it in a more crystal clear way, but potentially I think we can try using these lens to uncover some important developments elsewhere. And then, of course, I was thinking about this obsession because it's interesting how playing with post-colonial and decolonial approach, Svitlana combines the two. So she takes this decolonial claim for delinking, for this epistemic aspect of this sort of mental and cultural disentanglement from colonial patterns. But then she takes this post-colonial psychoanalytical Lacanian approach that there is always some very specific type of affection and attachment, and it's very irrational. And I was wondering if it could be qualified as self-colonization in this case, because Kiosi was talking about the case of Bulgaria, and it was sort of self-colonization on behalf of the West, which is at play in Russia and partly in Ukraine as well. So definitely the West is not like mentioned enough in this structure of coloniality. And I would think that this mutual emotional attachment between the colonizer and colonized, this is something omnipresent, and that is something that sort of perpetuates the dominance. And then I was wondering also, again, about the West or Europe, because Svitlana, you mentioned it somewhere in the book, that in a way Ukraine is safe, it will not build this ambicolonial attachment to Europe because it is built differently, it is built rationally. And I do have some reservations here because I imagine, especially if the claim for agency is not fully recognized and the decolonial release is not performed and Ukraine is stuck somewhere on the previous stages, then some sort of resentment might lure it into a sort of unhealthy attachment to Europe, which partly happened in the case of several Central European states. And that was the specificity of post-colonial developments in the Baltic states and Poland in the 2000s and how it was politically instrumentalized there. As I said, I do like the creativity and the concept creation. And from this perspective, the book is very philosophical. Like Deleuze are talking that philosophy is about like creation of concepts. So you are doing that. And it is philosophical in the sense that it does not spend too much effort on analyzing the argument from the sources that disagree with the author. So rather than mapping the field, you just choose the sources that help you build your argument. So this is not something that people do like in social sciences, but in philosophy and humanities, this is kind of the approach you are developing. And then, of course, some concept could be argued against. So I was thinking about this internal hybridity. Is it helpful? You juxtapose it to colonial hybridity. Is it helpful? Or should we think rather about heterogeneity, polyphony, diversity, equality that you invoke from Skovroda, or constructive plurality? So because hybridity has this very strong set of connotations. And then when you are juxtaposing diachronic and synchronic colonization, I would think that this swift colonization is rather military occupation and symbolic subjugation, but then colonization is exactly this like stealth and long-lasting process. But that's sort of like for a discussion. Otherwise, I really enjoyed the reading and thank you so much.
Thank you, Valeria. Now the microphone goes to Victoria.
Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you, Yogila, for the invitation to join this discussion. Thank you so much, Valeria, for your interesting insights. And of course, thank you so much, Svitlana, for the opportunity to expand my knowledge through your books and to rethink certain concepts. And I'd like to begin with what I believe unites both books. These books are both, of course, timely and deeply relevant. They help us better understand the ongoing process in Ukraine, what is happening, and how it is unfolding. And often when we approach this question through more conventional lenses than, for example, art and artistic practices, especially when thinking about identity formation in Ukraine, we usually tend to focus on general patterns, prevailing narratives, or transferable experiences. And in doing so, we sometimes may overlook certain nuances. And what makes these books, what makes Svetlana's books particularly important is that she draws on artistic practices, tools that are not entirely conventional or traditional in the field, for example, of political science or identity studies. Svitlana draws on artistic practices to reveal a distinctive vision of identity formation in Ukraine and defines this as a polyphonic identity emerging through a horizontal state-building paradigm. Another key contribution, which I will return a little bit later, is the rethinking of vocabulary that was mentioned by Valeria as well, and the proposal in these books of new, or it would be better to say, revised conceptual definitions. The re-examination of terms related to postcolonialism, decoloniality, anti-colonial resistance is, I believe, a significant achievement of both books. And finally, what I find especially important when looking at these books as a whole is their focus, art and artistic practices. And these become the primary sources of analysis, the central material through which broader political and cultural processes are interpreted. And Particularly in this regard, it is undoubtedly, in my opinion, one of the key contributions of both books. When we try to understand what is happening within states, how their identities are formed, how shifts in, for example, self-perception occur, we usually turn to more traditional sources, political speeches, official documents, or decision-making process, for example. And for someone like me working with visual practices, these books offer some kind of renewed legitimization of art as a form of practice through which questions related to state identity and self-understanding can be revealed. Questions that might otherwise be overlooked if we focus solely on conventional, traditional, institutional sources or practices. And regardless of the perspective we take, whether it is art history, art-based disciplines, or social science, or particularly political science approach, the concept of contextuality becomes absolutely essential. One cannot fully read or interpret meaning from art and artistic practices without considering the context in which specific artwork is created and manifested. And context as a being in a certain place at a certain time is a fundamental analytical and methodological element in any analysis. And it plays a particularly crucial role in both books. The analysis of artworks is framed by the aura of key political and historical moments: the Orange Revolution, Maidan, the annexation of Crimea, and of course, Russia's full-scale invasion. And a contextualized gaze makes it possible to identify expressions of hybrid identity, not in terms of binary oppositions, but as something unifying, connecting together different narrative lines, and thus contributing to the larger project of resistance in case of Ukraine. And in this way, these books, in my opinion, serve as strong methodological examples of how to work with context in the analysis of art from political and social science perspective, while at the same time reaffirming the central importance of contextuality itself. And what I would also like to emphasize here is the book, Art in Ukraine Between Identity Construction and Anti-Colonial Resistance, among other things, in my view, in my personal view, actively contributes to the academic discussion on artivism, or in other words, art-based activism, art-based social activism, what the author refers to as art activism. And in my opinion, this engagement is significantly not only because the book shows how art operates within the sphere of activism in contemporary Ukraine, but also because it reshapes and expands current understanding of artivism, art-based activism itself. Because while the roots of art activism can be traced back to the 1960s, the term began to be used around 1990s. In its early phase, it was primarily associated with anti-war and anti-globalist movements that used artistic expression as a form of protest. What this book does is broaden the scope of the term artivism, showing how it can function in times of military conflict during the war, and how it can carry resistance-oriented implications, specifically resistance against occupation and colonial domination. This, without a doubt, in my opinion, is one of the book's most important contributions. It as well offers a compelling overview of how Ukrainian art from 2004 to 2024 responds to war, occupation, and collective trauma. Through visual storytelling, archiving, and participatory practices, Ukrainian artists not only bear witness to the ruptures of their time, but actively shape a polyphonic, as Svitlana said, cultural narrative rooted in resistance. Their work reflects a significant shift from postcolonial ambiguity to a consciously decolonial stance, redefining identity to what the book calls a horizontal state-building paradigm. Ukrainian artists, in my opinion, in this context, serve as cultural curators of their own history, constructing meaning in the time of crisis. By doing so, they contribute as well to the, let's say, global knowledge production and challenge existing frameworks of art, identity, and resistance as well. So this book fills a crucial gap not only in documenting these practices that, of course, is important, but as well in curating them conceptually, offering both a methodology and a lens for understanding contemporary art's political and epistemic power. And taking my time into account, I want to gradually turn to the second book, Ambicoloniality and War. And I would say that this work is an effort to carefully trace how Ukraine's cultural heritage has, over the past 30 years, passed through distinct stages and has been gradually reclaimed into an autonomous, self-defined symbolic space. And importantly, the book does not speak only about art. It also reflects broader shifts in state identity and some kind of self-perception. These phases, which are often treated as a single uniform process, are here in these books given nuance and distinction. Overall, the book encourages a more holistic perspective on events that have been significant for Ukraine's national self-understanding. It resists the tendency to collapse or combine everything into a single unified narrative, and instead invites the reader to see key moments, such as the Maidan, not just as a part of the general trajectory, but as distinct turning points. And one of the book's central narratives revolves around the shift from postcolonial to decolonial thinking. And this is precisely where we can return to the question of rethinking the vocabulary. In generally, the application of colonial, post-colonial, and decolonial theories to the post-Soviet space is valued and contested within academia. At the same time, some scholars, as we all know, welcome these frameworks, while others critique them, arguing that the Soviet project does not fully align with classical models of colonization. The author, Svitlana, addresses this tension in detail in the book's introduction, while the book Ambicoloniality and War clearly engages with a broader historical scope, looking at Russian colonialism beyond just the Soviet period. I personally believe that this book makes a meaningful contribution to applying colonial, post-colonial, decolonial, anti-colonial approaches to the former Soviet sphere. At the same time, it highlights the importance of recognizing exceptions, particularities, and contextual nuances when doing so. At this point, what becomes especially important is what the author notes on page 220. I quote, "It shifts attention from the question of identity to the question of agency as a standpoint value in the contemporary world and simultaneously as the necessary condition for epistemic justice to be realized. And finally, moving to my questions about the books, I'd like to return briefly to a philosophical, because philosophical distinction that is often made when comparing propaganda and art, because these books have a lot of philosophical insights. Looking from the philosophical perspective, it is said that art needs democracy because its purpose is to foster a pluralism of ideas, perspectives, and interpretations, something that naturally emerges through creative artistic practices. So the Ukrainian case clearly illustrates this. Through art, we see the multiple crossing lines of hybridity, which becomes unifying rather than dividing, forming a new pluralistic collectivity of the Ukrainian state. So here I will stop and turn to my questions. And in my questions, I would like to bring together perspectives from both books, but let's start with the book Ambicoloniality and War. And my first question is more or less the same as was raised by Valeria. This book argues for epistemic justice through the recovery of agency rather than the affirmation of postcolonial identity alone. It speaks of new knowledge system emerging through cultural heritage, and in this sense, it proposes a kind of theoretical reset that I mentioned before, and that challenges existing postcolonial and decolonial models. And my question is, to what extent is this model, or it would be better to say, this theoretical reframing applicable to other states in, for example, former post-Soviet space? Where are my thoughts? Is the state of war, specifically Russia's full-scale invasion, the primary condition that enables us to speak about Ukraine's agency in these terms, or might other factors be relevant or sufficient in other countries' cases? My second question is related to art and art function. So how it could be proposed, the definition, the relationship between art and agency. Is art in this case primarily a representation of agency, a producer of it, or perhaps a mechanism that binds together both aspects, enacting and embodying agency simultaneously? And my final question, that is personally very important for me, relates to methodology and the status of art and artistic practices in not only in Svitlana's research, but in researchers in general. We all understand that art is not usually the first form of material, of documentation we turn to when analyzing identity or shifts in political thought. And yet, as your books demonstrate, artistic practices are particularly well suited for this. They allow for a more holistic approach and help reveal nuanced picture. So, in your view, Svitlana, are aesthetic, artistic practices beginning to move beyond the category of non-conventional research material? Could this type of material be gaining attraction and becoming more accepted, even conventional, in the field of, for example, identity studies, social sciences, etc., etc.
So that's your last question. That's correct, Victoria?
Yes,
Perfect.
absolutely.
So I think I will give the floor to three of you so you can proceed with discussion, and most probably I just start with asking Svitlana to answer the questions or to react or to say, what resonated with you with those very, I think, well-developed comments.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you so much, Valeria, and thank you so much, Victoria, for such generous feedback and for such very thoughtful, very in-depth questions that really made me think um, more about different aspects that I developed in my books, and I think this is a very meaningful dialogue. So thank you very much for that. I would like to start responding to Victoria's question about art and agency and how actually it coincides with and how is the relation between them in if you look from post-colonial and decolonial frameworks. And I believe that in my text, I believe that art when it comes to political expression, art always is representative of the underlying changes that are occurring in the society. And art is some kind of very immediate, often response that takes no distancing, as we see in many of the examples of protest art in Ukraine, as works of Katerina Lisovenko, for example, or many other examples, without kind of detaching from this ongoing historical process that it witnesses. It represents from its own angle, with its own methodology, the processes and the transformations that the society experiences. On the other hand, art is a very powerful mechanism for producing these social changes, as we see in the examples of Euromaidan, for example, when the artists were really agents of change, largely through not only their documentary practices, but more interactive, more performative practices that they with which they responded to transformation and how they fostered, with which they fostered this transformation. So, and this leads me to the question of internal hybridity as the question that can be interpreted precisely through the lens of contemporary art. Because in my book, Ambicoloniality and War, I precisely discuss how what is called now decolonization in Ukraine, how it occurs through actually the development of a functional system that needs to encompass all the areas of the functioning of the society, from some kind of grassroots initiatives to the non-profit private organizations to the public institutions that work as some kind of well-aligned mechanism in order to produce change. Artistic practice and artistic production is part of this. Is part of this process, and it is from its own kind of particular perspective represents this process. And when in 2022 Russia invaded a large part of Ukrainian territories, and the artists had to be displaced, and they moved from some regions in the south, some regions in the east, and they moved to the west in the country. And immediately some artistic residences began emerging in order to accommodate them, and then some kind of very different dialogues started occurring, which we can trace through a number of exhibitions from Kherson artists, for example, or the artists from Mariupol and the Donetsk region, and so on. And with the local artists and the local community, this exchange and this dialogue, it produced some kind of stylistic but also conceptual change in both contexts. And that's why I like this notion of internal hybridity, even if, yes, as Valeria mentioned, it somehow can be criticized because it somehow echoes the notion of post-colonial hybridity, and post-colonial hybridity by default is considered by many scholars as some kind of negative notions, as something that needs to be kind of get rid of, because it imposes the figure of colonizer onto the field of the colonized. But at the same time, we can see, for example, the approaches like Mexican anthropologist Nestor Garcia Conclini, who addresses hybridization from this point of view, not of the colonial theory, but rather he has developed his own framework, which is more like the structure related to post-structuralism, quite profoundly, and he doesn't see it as such a kind of negative moment. Similarly, in internal hybridity, while preserving this idea of a structure, doesn't necessarily need to rely to this negative connotations of etymology of post-colonial hybridity or post-colonial ambivalence. It is something I prefer it over the notions of heterogeneity, of polyphony, because I think it highlights in a much stronger way the dynamics of the exchange and the kind of the underlying structure of this exchange. That there is not kind of chaotic powers at work there, but there is rather a systemic approach when different elements from kind of micro to macro systems, they work together in order to foster epistemological and cultural production. Besides, I mentioned in both books, of course, the approach of Piotr Petrovsky of horizontal art history, and the ways precisely how the polyphony can be viewed within local context without going out to the wider and global context. And his approach is very close to me, yet Petrovsky himself was criticized. There is even an article published somewhere online in one of the online journals where he is criticizing the post-colonial approach, because for him it was needed to highlight precisely this independent component of cultural production, rather than turning to the wider picture of colonial impacts of the past. So this is partly what I'm working with in terms of art as example, just one of the possible examples that is representative of the processes ongoing in society. We can take any other case study that is related to other discipline, and we can find also the way how this represents particular societal processes. And this diversity I also consider in the particular coexistence of different movements that are non-linear within this situation of simultaneous coexistence, for example, of decolonial situation in Ukraine, as I mentioned before, which relates to this kind of already not even to the process of active decolonization, as a post-colonial condition, for example, is like slow decolonization process. But the colonial situation aims to end this process of rethinking, and the slow process was very abrupt and very fast track way, yet it is a way that is not taken by anti-colonial resistance. And what is important that now in Ukraine, these two currents are coexisting very notoriously. That is decolonial detachment and the production of certain indifference to Russian impacts, Russian historical and current colonialism, and the focus on the production of own epistemologies and the production of own texts, own artistic works as examples of all these narratives and texts and so on. And there is active anti-colonial resistance, that is the resistance on the front line, but also which finds its anti-colonial expression in the artistic works and in literary works and generally in culture. So there is this paradoxical situation that the anti-colonial resistance in normal model is just a short moment when a colonial state is falling apart. But because we live in this very paradoxical condition of neo-colonial aggression on Ukrainian territory, this anti-colonial stance reemerges again. So this also contributes to this idea of numerals rather than one single or linear sequence of processes that are ongoing on Ukrainian territory. And I hope that I managed to illustrate that particularly in the book Ambicoloniality and War, in which I quite consciously, and this is to the question of Valeria about possible exceptionalism of this case. Usually in my work, I undertake cooperative perspective. For example, just a few months before the onset of the full-scale invasion started in 2022, in November 2021, I published an edited volume that was called Contemporary Ukrainian and Baltic Art, Political and Social Perspectives from 1991 to 2021. And there I precisely tried to undertake this perspective of how we can compare the questions of memory, identity, and a number of other very important key notions within Baltic art practices and Ukrainian art practices. And also I have this always, of course, when I use, for example, Latin American thinkers and their work, and I refer to them, I also try to undertake this comparative perspective. It was important for me in Ambicoloniality and War to focus on the Ukrainian and Russian case as a case study, because it precisely in the way of Peter Petrovsky, but also in my own way, it helped to develop kind of a more profound vision rather than expanding the view, rather than concentrating on very different aspects of all these processes that are ongoing inside this entangled cultural field. And that was the reason that precisely I focused on these two particular cases. And I think, and I propose that also in the conclusions of the book, that this can be, of course, a model, can be a theoretical model, can be expanded to post-Soviet space, to many countries of the post-Soviet space, particularly if we think about Baltic countries. And generally, this model can work whenever we encounter this question of borderland as some kind of dividing line, but also the line through which the entanglement and the filtering goes on, and where the cultural proximity manifests itself. So I hope that precisely the book of Ambicoloniality helps to develop a useful method, which can be, with certain modifications, applied to different cases, and can be of use not only to Ukrainian researchers, but also to those researchers of countries that, whether from post-colonial or decolonial perspective or any other perspective, as applied to their own respective regions. So I wrote it partly as some kind of useful tool for applying to different cases that can be then further reinterpreted, developed, and so on. Yeah, so thank you very much for the questions.
Thank you. I just put you on the screen so you're able to continue the discussion. But I also would like to open the floor to others who would like to ask the question. And there's one question in the chat that I would like to read. It's by Daria. So the question is starts with thanking Svitlana and Valeria. Thank you for your interesting takes on decoloniality and bicoloniality. Some time ago, I registered the term postcoloniality while reading activist papers online. What is your view on this term?
Postcoloniality. I think it's a very interesting term, but in this model that I use, for example, is the decolonial situation. I think is something that comes after postcoloniality. So if it is in sense it's something that is after and is kind of argumented and justified in the proper way, why not to use that term? I'm generally very a supporter of diverse visions and diverse interpretations, but I'm not acquainted with that term, that I must say.
Yeah, since the question was also addressed to me, I can quickly comment that all the notions are conventional, right, in the academic community, and it depends on the meaning attached to these notions. So the one way, the neutral way would be to think that it's exactly something that comes after the colonial obsession, right? It's in a way after the release and sort of proceeding to the next stage. However, it is often used in the contemporary world as a sort of wishful thinking that the colonial era is over. And rather than exploring the existing types of colonization and coloniality, we are moving towards more subtle forms of economic exploitation, epistemic imperialism, cultural imperialism, and so on and so forth. So from this perspective, I think this is very important, but we should not indulge in this illusion that colonial oppression is over, especially if it's not only about the Russian most overt neo-colonial conquest in Ukraine, potentially expanding further, but also a new wave of legitimization of colonial rhetoric in the second administration of Trump, which is suddenly becomes an acceptable trope of public speeches from top figures. From this perspective, I would say that we should try to focus on both. It should not be an exclusionary either or logic. And also, I believe usually when people use this term, it marks a certain narrative which is very suspicious towards the national grammar. And they were trying to think in transnational terms, discrediting the imperial nation states binaries as well. So it could be labeling a certain set of underlying beliefs, and then it's certainly not neutral. And we need to be aware what exactly, how we are using the notion and what is the context.
Thank you. If anyone else would like to ask the question, you can either raise your hand or write your questions in the chat. And I give space for that, but besides that, would you like to continue? Would you like to inquire any other questions that were answered? I'm referring to Victoria and Valeria. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
I would be curious to ask another question, which I skipped in my first part, if we have space for that. I was wondering how decolonization, decolonial detachment and release, if it has the conditionality of de-imperial release on the other side. Because when we talk about post-colonial and decolonial cases, they are developing after the end of the colonial subjugation rather than in the wake of a recolonization in Snyder's work, right? So I think in some place in your book on Ambicoloniality, you are saying that it's enough for Ukraine to detach from Russia and then it will be on its own. So somehow what I'm trying to say, it's possible to escape this trap one-sidedly, and no mutuality is needed. And I'm really thinking, if there will be no de-imperialization on the side of Russia, will not we be lured back in this trap?
Valeria, thank you for your question. Well, I see decolonization as some kind of very durable process that encompasses precisely all these stages, as I mentioned, and that when I write about synchronic and diachronic colonization, it has the respective stages of decolonization to oppose it, and it is either slow or swift decolonization, and precisely the decolonial situation, the colonial detachment, and the epistemological change produced by it, it refers to the swift decolonization. That's something that needs to be done rapidly when the system, out of a sudden, just starts falling apart. And this is something that we precisely could observe with the Euromaidan events as a turning point, and then all these new narratives that started being produced after 2014 in relation to the war, in relation to own identities, in relation to all these questions of uprootedness, displacement, and so on. And this is also part of this decolonization process. In theory, decoloniality as this kind of horizon of events, which I call also decolonial release, that when there is this full detachment from the colonial, post-colonial and imperial impacts occurs, it is something very hypothetical. Because of course, for that the ambivalence needs to be dissolved, and all this post-colonial hybridity needs to be dissolved, and this is something that will, is very difficult to imagine that will happen, because of course no new texts will fully dismantle the structures that were built for centuries. And also the question is whether it's really needed to dismantle that structure that was, or it's just like to change our point of view on the structure. For example, if you think about the Soviet legacies and the Soviet mosaics and all this works of Soviet art that are under now this discussion of whether to preserve them or to discard them as a legacy, but rather as some kind of traumatic burden from the past and so on. So this is one aspect. The other aspect is precisely this very binary vision of ambicoloniality that, as I was proposing in the presentation, that there is this practically like two pillars that are supporting this entanglement, and if one pillar is already demolished by all these processes ongoing from one side of the border, and then the colonizer, former or aspiring colonizer, also will not be able to sustain this system. And in this way, and practically the intentions of Russia in that case would be to sustain this ambicoloniality as a mutual entanglement, and to sustain all these processes of the daily filtering, appropriation, affection, and then eventually transgression, that are the stages of this ambicolonial relation. So yes, there is always a risk, of course, of return of all this of all these notions, of all these processes, because of the simple geographical connection. But the cultural proximity is something that is transforming dramatically now, and something that is changing in kind of very fast and in a large extent, and to at least one of these kind of standpoints of ambicolonial relationship is dissolving. So yeah, it's like it is, of course, as hypothetical as the decoloniality, precisely this full detachment is also a hypothetical possibility. But the question of the neocolonial war and all these questions of necessities of resistance, either through creation of some kind of quite radical texts, or through creation of kind of indifference to the colonial impacts, they call precisely for this for this action. So yes, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think maybe to make it like one level down, the more specific question would be: do you think that syncretic polarization is temporal, or is it like long lasting? Could it be reversible? Because I think we have some difference in our disciplinary backgrounds. You are an art historian and you work with the artistic community, and I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm looking at sociological polls, and I see a bit of reversal of certain trends in the wake of the full-scale invasion. So I'm asking myself, and also using the opportunity to ask you, do you think all those trends are reversible, or we are more or less on a stable track of this polarization, of like highlighting differences with Russia rather than commonalities?
I think this syncretic polarization can be quite a durable process and having quite durable effects, because the changes that we observe in any field, practically in social sciences, in art history, in kind of non-academic fields, they are so dramatic, and they are so profound, that it's not already some kind of singular reaction to the neocolonial aggression, but is rather already a development of some kind of new epistemological foundations, some new knowledge, and some new structures that are basing themselves upon this new knowledge. So I do believe that the syncretic polarization can be quite long-term and quite a durable outcome of all the situation.
I think that's a very positive note to go to the end of the seminar. I'm giving the last chance for audience to ask the questions. Don't see any hands. So thank you, everyone, for attending the seminar. Thank you very much, Svitlana, Valeria, and Victoria, for participating in this engaging discussion. I'm very happy that we organized this seminar. And on behalf of PoSoCoMeS seminar team, I invite you to the following seminars in the autumn. Have a nice evening and have a nice summer.
Thank you for the
very much.
invitation, for the discussion.
you.
Thank you, Svitlana, for this intellectually stimulating talk.